Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to the next episode of Holistic Healing with Lori. I'm Lori Rivers, and I help people with long COVID and ME, CFS, and other chronic illnesses to fully recover. I teach you how to fully recover. Now, I've actually been nervous about filming these episodes on parasites because it is so important. And because I know that for any kind of chronic illness, understanding how parasites are affecting you and causing these chronic symptoms is the most important thing in achieving a full recovery. Now, yes, there are other things that are helpful along the way and that come into play and that I teach in my Relief and Transformation course and also in the membership, but this is absolutely the key, is dealing with these parasites. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a lot of those specific parasites. And I'm going to tell you, it's gross. And if you start to listen to it and it makes you feel icky, then just know that you don't need to know all those specifics. Other people find it really helpful and really interesting. I actually find it really interesting now. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through some of the broader basics first before we get into that stuff. So if you are feeling a little queasy and icky about this, you'll probably be okay until we get into those specifics. So I just want to go through a broad overview of why parasites cause these chronic illnesses, right? So in developed countries, in countries like the US, Canada, most of Europe, Australia, the medical community says that parasites are not a problem for us. They're only in underdeveloped countries and things like that. And the title of this podcast series of all these episodes is called The Ignored Epidemic, because I truly believe that this is, again, the cause of any of these chronic illnesses. And we're seeing such a rise over the past several decades in these chronic illnesses. And it's because we're ignoring parasites. In other countries, people regularly do parasite cleanses. So let's look at how these parasites cause chronic illnesses. And I'm going to be going into more detail about this in an upcoming episode, but just so you get the broad overview, the way I describe this is that our bodies are like a house. And that house, when we have chronic illness, the house has termites. And those, of course, are the parasites. And what that happens, if you've ever heard of termites, or if you've ever, hopefully not, but if you've ever had them in your house before, it's this silent invader that is actually literally eating away at the structure of the house. And so over time, the infestation gets bigger and bigger, and the structure of the house is more and more compromised and becomes weaker and weaker. Same thing with the body. Now, the other thing that happens, because some people are like, okay, yeah, I can look back on my medical history, and sometimes some people can say, yeah, I had asthma when I was a kid, or I had some chronic symptoms, but they weren't so bad. But then this thing happened, this event, right? Or they didn't notice any kind of chronic symptoms. And it was just that they got sick after this big event. So in the example of long COVID, the storm is this big event, right? The storm of COVID. And because that house, the structure of the house is already so compromised, the storm causes so much more destruction. It causes the collapse. So that can be a virus. It can be stress. If you go through a very traumatic experience, it can also just be a gradual buildup of all of those things, of stress, a bigger microbe load over time, right? And when I say microbes, that's interchangeable with parasites. Now, the other thing, it's important when we're talking about rebuilding this house, you don't go in and start to rebuild the house until you've taken care of those termites, right? And done a really good job of taking care of those termites. Because otherwise you rebuild the house and then the termites that are still there just eat it up again. And then the other thing to remember is that everybody, literally everybody and every living thing has parasites to a certain degree. The difference between a chronic illness state body versus a healthy body or a non-chronic illness, non-chronic symptom body is the balance between the good microbes that are in your body and these parasites. Now, another misconception that people have is that parasites only live in the gut, that they only live in the digestive system or in the intestines. And that is absolutely not true. Parasites, you can have parasites anywhere in your body. You can have them in your brain. You can have them in your spinal cord, in your nervous system, in your blood, your lungs, your organs, and then, of course, in your intestines as well. Even in your sinuses. When we talk about the microbiome, we're not only talking about the gut. I wanted to make sure that you understand that. Now, we're also going to be talking about what you can do to take care of these parasites. And I wish that I could say that it's an easy fix and that you can do it with just one parasite cleanse or maybe even 2 or 3 parasite cleanses. But what I find is that for people who have developed these chronic symptoms, that it takes a good bit of work to get the body to get rid of that heavy parasite load and to rebalance the microbiome to bring those good microbes back in. And you can't just do one or the other. It needs to be a combination of both. And then at the same time, you also need to be supporting your body's drainage system, right? Your detox pathways and all that stuff. And you might have heard those terms before, but maybe you don't know exactly what those are. So we are going to be talking more about that in this series on parasites as well, on this ignored epidemic. Actually, real quickly, I just want to go through a couple of quotes from some other people who are tuned into this parasite epidemic. The first one is Dr. Herman Bueno. And he says that most individuals would be truly amazed if they knew the extraordinarily high number of Americans who are unknowingly infected by parasites. And again, I can attest to that personally from my own experience of literally seeing worms passed in my stool. And then I did a little in my relief and transformation class this past Tuesday. We meet once a week. And I said, okay, everybody who has actually seen parasites in your stool, raise your hand. And all but 2 people in the class raise their hand. And we actually do the happy worm dance anytime anybody says, I just saw a worm. And the 2 people who did not raise their hands are new. And then there was one other person, and my guess is that she has actually passed some parasites, but just hasn't seen them. And then also she's dealing with a lot of fungus as well, which you don't really notice with the human eye. I can attest to my students, they're like, at the beginning of the course, I thought, oh, probably not. I don't think that's a thing for me. And then a couple of weeks in, or sometimes a couple of months in, they're like, okay, yep, I believe it now. Dr. Ross Anderson, ND, says other prominent physicians agree with me that in human history, the parasite challenge is likely the most unrecognized of all endemic problems because they cannot be seen and rarely present immediate symptoms. And that's another thing that we'll be talking about more in another upcoming episode. They remain invisible as a cause or contributing factor to what can be a serious disorder. And I completely agree with that. And again, we're going to talk about this some more when we talk about how parasites cause symptoms. But because it's such a slow burn kind of thing, you don't typically look to that. So let's talk about the different kinds of parasites, of microbes. Now, when I use the term parasites, I'm not only talking about the worms, not only talking about the helminths. We're talking about viruses, we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about single-celled organisms, and about those multicellular organisms. And those are your worms. So let's talk about the size, because this comes into play with how we approach dealing with parasites in the relief and transformation course. So viruses are the smallest of all of these infectious agents, and they're about 100 billion of a meter, and they have so few genes and proteins of their own that, they want to reproduce. So they actually take over the cells in our bodies and use our cells' machinery to reproduce. So they commandeer those cells, which obviously can be very problematic in lots of different ways. The next up on the size chart here is bacteria. And this is what we think of usually when we think of the microbiome and the gut, right? Is this good and bad bacteria? So bacteria really have a wide variation in their size and shape, but they tend to be at least 10 times bigger than viruses. And they are these single-celled organisms that reproduce independently, right? So they don't need to take over our cells and our cells' machinery, though they do end up sometimes invading the cells and damaging them for sure. Then we have your single-cell organisms, and these are usually about 10 times larger than bacteria, and they're usually about 0.01 millimeters long. And this includes protozoa and things like that. We're going to be talking more about the specifics of that in just a bit here. And then you have, and these are the ones that you most often see in pictures and hear people talking about, your multicellular organisms. And these are the ones that are so big that they can be seen with the naked eye. Now, the biggest ones of these are your tapeworms, and they can reach up to 20 feet, and that's 6 meters. Wow, that's pretty gross. That's pretty crazy. But the thing is, we're not just looking at those really big ones, but also at the baby versions of these, the whole reproduction cycle, the eggs, and then the larva, and then all these things. So we'll go into more about the different types of those in just a bit here as well. Now, how do we get parasites? This is a common question that I get, which is totally understandable. And what I would say is that your food and water are the most common sources of parasites. And again, you're never going to be able to 100% evade parasites. It's just not going to happen. But you can do some things to lessen that exposure a little bit. So food and water. And when you think about it, because most of us eat 3 times a day and drink water frequently throughout the day, hopefully, our exposure to these sources is constant. So tap water, of course, you do not want to drink tap water. You want to drink purified water, or even better, distilled water. With that distilled water, you want to add in some trace minerals to replenish the minerals that are taken out during that distillation process. But the distillation process is really the only thing that's going to take out all of the harmful components, including things like fluoride and stuff like that. Now, both plant and animal foods carry parasites. It's not just the animal foods. And even cleaning and cooking them sometimes don't fully destroy the parasites before we eat them. According to the CDC, food is behind about 80% of the pathogenic outbreaks. Now, the thing is that they're only looking at these outbreaks, right? They're not taking into consideration all of these stealthy things that are happening for people over time. And then also animals, right? If you have a pet, we love our fur babies, absolutely. but they can very easily become infected, right? You might actually do regular deworming of your pet. And if you don't, you definitely should. But even then, even if you are deworming them, they can still carry these parasites, these unhealthy organisms, and then transmit them to us, right? And then also, same thing, they can become parasite ridden or get these parasites from food and water. So if I think about my sister's amazing dog, and when we go down to the river with them, they will just drink the water, which will then cause them to throw up in a little bit, which of course means that there are a lot of parasites in that water. But if you just think about anytime a pet's outside, they're probably going to be lapping up water from puddles and things like that. And then also in their fur, right? They like to roll around and poop. Yeah. So making sure that you wash your hands right after you after you pet your animal or clean up after your animal, you definitely want to do that. And also don't let them lick you in the mouth or on the face even. They're a wonderful part of our lives, but you definitely need to be taking care of that. So actually in textbooks, animals are a major carrier of these harmful organisms, and people just don't think about it. So experts have projected that of the 110 million pet dogs and cats in this country alone, in the US alone, over half of them might be infected with at least one or more different kinds of harmful organisms. And I would actually say that all of them are. Because again, if you are a living organism, then you have some sort of pathogen, you have some sort of parasite. But just considering those numbers and knowing that it's most likely 10 times that many, and all of them actually, the potential for transmission of these parasites from animals to humans is very high. I truly believe that everybody on Earth should be doing a full parasite cleanse, which includes for treating for fungus as well, doing that 3 to 4 times a year, just absolutely. And again, in other countries, that is a normal thing to do. That's a normal thing to do. Let's talk about the different types of some of the more specifics of parasites. Now, I'm not even talking about all of the ones that are out there, right? There are something like over 700 different types of parasites that can infect humans, and that's just an estimation. My guess is there are probably a lot more. Again, though, I don't want to freak you out because there are things that you can do to take care of this. We're going to start out with protozoa. And protozoa actually make up about 70% of all of these invading organisms. And you can't even see them, right? 70% of the pathogens you can't even see. When my students do see pathogens, when they do see worms in their stool, we're like, okay, that's great that you're seeing that. But also remember that you're also getting rid of these protozoa as well and the other one-celled organisms. So don't let their size fool you, because certain ones of them, because they are able to reproduce rapidly, can actually take over the intestinal tract of their host. And then from there, they go to other organs and tissues. Now, one of the issues that we run into here is that the gut is usually so compromised that it has little tears in the intestines already, which means that these parasites, they are able to have access to the bloodstream, which then gives them access to every single part of the body. From there, from the intestines, all of these different organisms are able to go on to other organs and tissues, like what we talked about earlier with the nervous system, the lungs, the liver, all the organs, the blood, all those things. And then some of the protozoa actually produce cysts. And this is really interesting. And these are these sacs that they are within. And then the sac can be safely transported through the food and water from one person to another. And then our stomach acids and our body's immune system aren't really able to take care of the protozoa because they're in that cyst state. And these one-cell protozoa can actually destroy the tissues of their hosts. And just to give an idea, according to experts, an estimated 7 million people across the US have some sort of protozoa living inside of them. And again, I think that this is vastly underestimated. But some of the common protozoa, these include, and we'll see how I do with pronouncing some of these, Indolamax nana, Giardia, Entamoeba histolytica, Cryptosporidium parvum, which you'll find the cryptos usually in like rivers and lakes, Blastocytus hominis, Trichomonas vaginalis, Toxoplasma gondii, Cyclospora cayatensis. That was a tough one. And then Cryptosporidium rearis, Pneumocystis carinei, and a bunch more. I won't go through all of those, but there are several more. Now, let's talk about the nematodes. And these are where we start to get to our multicellular organisms, where we can actually see them, right? So while the protozoans are only single cell, the nematodes that we're talking about here, they are multicellular. And the adult worms, they multiply by producing eggs called ova or larvae. And these eggs can become infectious in soil or in an intermediate host before we are, as humans, infected by them. Now, again, this is important to note that unless the worm infestation is heavy, you don't really show signs of the infestation. So again, most people have some parasites, but until it gets out of balance, then you might not notice it. And also the symptoms that you notice that you have, as you have noticed, they aren't usually, they're just under the radar, right? So all of your tests come back normal and all that stuff. Honestly, it's okay for us to have a couple of parasites. It's just when they start to get out of control that they cause problems, things like organ obstruction even. And again, this is another statistic that I would say is actually more than this, but experts claim that some type of worm is already in the intestines of over 75% of the world's population. And again, I would say even more than that. So some common nematodes include roundworm, hookworm, pinworm, a different type of round, Trichinella strongyloides, filaria, and anine larva. And you can read more about what each of those do. We might talk a little bit more about that. The next one is Cestoda. This is another multicellular organism. This is another type of worm. And it's among the oldest of the known parasites. So guess what it is? These are the super big ones. These are the tapeworms. And they are considered actually humanity's largest intestinal inhabitant. But I also want to say that they have been found in smaller or larger sizes in the spinal cord, in the brain as well. And I'm going to be doing a podcast at some point about how some of the medications that are used for tapeworms have been found to be very helpful in patients with Alzheimer's. Why is that? Let's see. Because it's taking care of the tapeworms. I would posit, I would theorize that it's because they're taking care of the tapeworms. The tapeworms, they each have a head that attaches to the intestinal wall or to other parts of the body. And as long as that head is still attached, a new worm can grow from it. So we're dealing with one of those things like the little lizards where you can pop off their tail and they'll grow a new one. So the same thing with tapeworms. Now, they do not themselves have digestive tracts, but they get their nourishment from directly absorbing partially digested substances from the host. So you can also see with all of these because they are taking your nutrition. You can see how some of your lab results might be coming back as you being low in certain nutrients. And now we go back to our metaphor of the house being like a body, right? If your house is still infested with those parasites, and you come in and you start to try to put a whole bunch of nutrients in there, then yes, that might help to support the house a little bit more. But at the same time, as the termites are continuing to proliferate and to reproduce, they're taking more and more of those nutrients as well, even the extra ones that you're giving yourself. So you absolutely need to be addressing those parasites. So the tapeworms, they're whitish in color, they're flat. They have a ribbon covering that's transparent. And some of those common cestodas are beef tapeworm, pork tapeworm, fish tapeworm, and dog tapeworm. And yeah, you've probably heard of tapeworms before. But again, they aren't necessarily going to be huge. They might also be in their smaller stage and still causing problems. Now, the last one we're going to talk about here today are trematodes. And these are leaf-shaped flatworms that are also known as flukes. You might have heard of liver flukes before. And these are their parasites during just about all of their life cycle forms, right? So even as larvae, when they're released into freshwater sometimes by infected snails, those free-swimming larvae can then directly penetrate the skin of a human or fish or other crustaceans. And then they continue to grow inside of there and can be transmitted from those crustaceans and fish and vegetation as well. So some common ones include intestinal fluke, blood fluke. We were talking about how a lot of these parasites can infect the blood as well. Also the liver fluke, the oriental lung fluke, and the sheep liver fluke as well. So this particular episode ended up taking way longer than I thought it was going to, but it has so much good information in it. So what we did was we broke it up into 2 different episodes. The next episode in this series on the ignored epidemic of parasites, we're going to go into more detail about the different types of parasites that we're talking about here. Keeping in mind that I don't even go into viruses or some of the bacteria and things like that, fungus we don't get into, but we're talking more about some of these multi-cellular organisms. Make sure also to sign up for my masterclass series that's coming up in October of 2023 here. And we're going to be going through more on parasites, how they affect the body and what you can do about them. And that's a live class. So you can submit your questions beforehand, or you can join us live, which I love because I love interacting with you. And we'll be chatting about all things parasites. One of the other master classes is going to be on balancing the nervous system. And this is going to be a hands-on class where we do it together. We balance the nervous system. And then another class that's within this masterclass series in October, these live classes, that's going to be on foods that will support and nourish you during this process, and which ones to stay away from as well. And you do need to register for that. And there will be replays available for a limited amount of time, unless you're in the membership or the full relief and transformation course, in which case you can have access to those at any point. I will see you then. And also, just to sign off here, I prefer to focus, like when I'm working with people and in the courses and the membership program, we really focus on solutions. We touch on the problem very slightly, and then we focus on solutions. So these episodes of the podcast, of the Holistic Healing with Lori podcast, we're focusing more on the problem. I think it's important because you want to know what you're dealing with here. And when those light bulbs start to go off, then you're going to be more motivated, more inspired to take the right actions to be able to take care of this. And that's important. So overall, I just want you to know that there is hope, that when you do take these steps to take care of the body, to open the detox pathways and to get rid of these pathogens, and along with the other things that we do in the course with mindset and things like that, but mainly these parasites, right? That a full recovery is completely possible. Not only possible, but really it's going to happen eventually. It does take time though. So I hope that is all helpful. Please make sure to subscribe and to share with other people. And I will see you in the next video. I can't wait to see you in the next episode.